Hi everyone, this is once again History of Ancient Rome at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young. In the last video lecture we talked about some of the peoples of early Italy. One group I forgot to mention that I will talk about very briefly are the Celts. You can see on the map here in the kind of light yellow color all the way up here we have these groups called the Celts. Not to be confused with, Ireland or Scotland or something like that, which is eventually where the Celtic peoples end up. The Celts were a major group of the Indo-European linguistic family, and Celtic peoples populated large parts of what is now Europe, extending all the way over into the Middle East in the ancient world. And they tended to be quite warlike, though that may be a stereotype from ancient sources more than anything. But occasionally these Celtic peoples did threaten Rome. One particular Celtic group that comes up frequently are called the Gauls. In fact, the whole region of what is now France was known to the Romans as Gaul, and not just that, but even northern Italy. The Po River Valley was known as Cisalpine Gaul, meaning the Gaul on this side of the Alps. That's because of its association with the Celtic peoples who ranged widely across those territories. So we will meet these various Celtic peoples a couple of times in the history of the Republic and talk about them a little bit. Just wanted to make you aware of them. I wanted to devote the majority of our time today to discussing the Etruscans and the Greeks. These are both really important peoples of early Italy. They both made a significant mark on Roman history, and so it's worth taking a little time to talk about them. With the Etruscans, although we know they were tremendously important, for one, they controlled a kingdom that in probably the 7th century BCE came to incorporate Rome. The Etruscans are credited with turning Rome into a city from a collection of kind of loosely organized villages. The Etruscans were a very urban people. They were, in addition to that, they were urbane in the sense that they had a highly developed culture. We can see that in their art, their religion, their literature, and we'll talk about a few of these things. These elements of Etruscan society, Etruscan civilization, had a significant impact on the development of Rome. The Romans borrowed a lot of terms from the Etruscans. They borrowed some religious ideas. They borrowed thoughts about divination. They borrowed a lot of their kind of aesthetic culture from the Etruscans, and this early interaction with them left a lasting impact on their sense of identity for reasons that we will talk about as we discuss Livy and some of the stories he tells about early Rome. The problem is that the Etruscan language, first of all, is almost entirely indecipherable to modern scholars. We only know about 100 words in this language, and this is partly because Etruscan is not related to any known language family. It is its own thing. It probably did have... There were probably other languages that came from similar origins, that were part of a larger language family, but all of those have disappeared, and the Etruscan language is the only one we know even a little bit about. And so it's almost impossible to then decipher languages that have no cognates, meaning no similar words, apart from those that are kind of adopted into Latin. Words like, one that comes to mind is the word persona, right? Which means person. It can also mean something like face in Latin, but that was originally an Etruscan word, and it's one that has resonance in kind of culture all through Western civilization. And so, we don't know really anything about the Etruscans from their own language. We do know something from their art and some of their material remains and things like this, but nothing from the language itself. The Romans both loathed and admired the Etruscans simultaneously, right? They admired many of the things that the Etruscans did, but they also loathed them because of their kind of fraught political and social interactions, especially the incorporation of Rome into this kingdom early on, and then the breaking away of Rome, becoming independent from the Etruscan kings, from the Tarquin dynasty, as it was called. And so, Roman authors tend to let that influence the way they think about the Etruscans. There were ancient Romans who were fascinated with the Etruscans. The most prominent among these is the Emperor Claudius, who was the step-grandson of Augustus Caesar, something like that, maybe great-grandson, I can't remember the exact relationship. But Claudius, who was a rather intellectual fellow, spent much of his life learning about the Etruscans. He wrote, it seems, dozens of works about the Etruscans, none of which have survived. And he even translated texts from Etruscan into Latin, but again, none of those have survived. So unfortunately, the sources don't give us a lot to go on with the Etruscans. One of the key questions in the study of the Etruscans is the question of origins. And there are basically two ideas about this that have cropped up over the centuries. And these go all the way back to the ancient Romans themselves. They commented on where the Etruscans came from. One thought is that these were kind of indigenous peoples of Italy that, back from time out of mind, they had lived in Italy. And, the fact that Etruscan is not related to any other language that we know of indicates that they were definitely separate from, other people, and that there were lots of migrants to Italy who supplanted everybody who spoke a related language except for the Etruscans. And so there may be something to that. The other thought is that the Etruscans had Asiatic origins, that they came from perhaps Asia Minor, perhaps the Middle East originally, probably getting to Italy sometime in the middle of the second millennium BCE. Now, the most accepted explanation seems to be some combination of those two these days, right? That the Etruscans were migrants from Asia in the time period that I talked about, but that they encountered people in Italy, the Villanovan culture of the late Bronze and early Iron Ages, and that these people intermixed, and the Etruscan language seems to have supplanted the native Villanovan language, but probably borrowed some words from it and borrowed some of the culture of the native Italians, and that this was a composite society, so to speak. But it's difficult to know these things without the sources giving us any clear evidence for any of this. There's always going to be some element of speculation. The Etruscans did, by the 7th century BCE or so, and so this is contemporary to the Greeks. The Greeks had started to build their polis, their city-states, as we call them, by, the early part of the 7th century BCE. This is when Sparta conquers the Messenians, for instance. This is about the time that Athens really comes into its own as an emerging city. And so the Etruscans are doing the same thing around the same time, right? The 7th and 6th centuries are the heyday of Etruscan culture, and this corresponds with the Archaic Age in Greece. There were a collection of cities, each one of which was ruled by a monarch of some kind. Now, the Etruscan word for monarch or king is lucumo, but we shouldn't think of a king as someone who rules over a wide territory. Rather, he, and it seems to have always been a male, did rule. He only ruled over kind of a city-state, right? The population center with its surrounding farmland. And there was an organization of these cities, kind of a loose confederation of them called, by the Romans, the Etruscan League. And the various, I got to think of the plural on this. Lucumones, I think, is the plural on that. Sorry, I didn't mean to distract with something so trivial. I just can't remember what it is. In any case, yeah, Lucumones, that's what it is. I just found it. So the Lucumones would have this organization where they would all of the Lucumones of the various cities would come together in a kind of, you almost want to call it a parliament of some kind. They would discuss the matters of the day. They even elected a kind of senior Lucumo to be the head of the Etruscan League, though this was something that rotated frequently, so no one city could gain dominance over the others. Each Lucumo had an attendant known as the lictor, and the lictor carried the symbol of power of the Lucumo, and this is called the fasces. Okay, so the picture you see here on the upper right-hand corner of the slide is of the lictor and the fasces. Why is this important? Well, this becomes one of the symbols of Roman power. The Roman emperors had lictors and fasces preceding them in procession and things like this, right? So this is a really good example of something that's borrowed by the Romans from the Etruscans. A fasces is a double-bladed axe that is wrapped in a set of, I think it's 12 sticks, and wrapped with ribbon of some kind, and this would be carried. I guess it's the symbolism here is you've got an axe, which is a symbol of obvious power and strength and an edge and all of that, but it is bound by these sticks, right? So the Lucumo is capable of military power, but he tries to keep this under wraps, I guess. That's kind of the symbolism. And, this is a really powerful symbol for the Etruscans, and then, as I said, borrowed by the Romans. Augustus Caesar, for instance, had the fasces carried before him in procession. So the Romans found a great deal to like about that image. In the 7th and 6th centuries, the Etruscans expand not only militarily, coming to incorporate, a fairly wide swath of the Italian peninsula. You can see on the map here how much territory the Etruscans controlled, not only here in northern Italy, but down into Campania. Even the city of Rome, was incorporated into one of these Roman city kingdoms, and then some parts of Corsica as well. The Etruscans came into conflict with some of the Greeks down here in Campania and defeated them in military battles. On occasion, the Greeks did strike back, and there's a kind of back and forth military expansion between the Etruscans and the Greeks. As they expanded militarily, they also expanded economically. Some of these cities grew quite wealthy, developed a taste for luxury goods. This is one of the main ways that we sort of detect the movements of Etruscan history, is to see what kinds of material remains come to the fore in which periods. One thing that we find in great abundance in Etruscan archaeological digs, is Attic pottery, and by that we mean pottery produced in the Greek peninsula of Attica, where Athens is, also where Corinth is. And these were major pottery producing centers. Both black and red figure pottery was in wide demand all over the Mediterranean. The Etruscans had a particular taste for this. And so, that they were able to purchase in bulk whole shiploads of this pottery coming from Greece gives us a sense of the kind of wealth and economic might the Etruscans possessed. In interacting with the Greeks, the Etruscans adopted the basic military strategies and tactics that the Greeks were employing to expand their influence. This is especially true with what's called the hoplite phalanx. This is a military formation where people are tightly packed together. The soldiers carry a large shield, usually round shield. This is opposed to the Italian peoples who tended to carry a square or rectangular shield in this early period. But the hoplite shield is a large round shield that probably weighed 40 or 50 pounds. And they would have a short sword, but their primary offensive weapon was a spear. These soldiers, the hoplites as they're called, the shield is called the hoplon in Greek. The soldiers are called hoplites. They would pack themselves close together, forming a shield wall, several ranks deep, and they would march against their opponents and kind of, mow them down with this great momentum produced by this tight formation. This is the ancient equivalent of like a tank or something, right? It's impossible to stop except with a rival hoplite phalanx. especially if the fight is happening on a plain, on flat ground. And eventually the Romans are going to adopt the hoplite phalanx too, at least for a few centuries. Sometime around the beginning of the 5th century BCE, many of these cities seem to undergo a political change. This might signify a reduction in military might or economic wealth or something like that. The number of these luxury goods decreases at that point in the archaeological evidence. One of the byproducts of this is the breakaway of Rome itself from the Tarquin monarchy, which we'll talk about in the next video lecture at greater length. But the Etruscan cities seem to have gone away from the government of the Lucumo and instead established an oligarchy of several wealthy individuals, wealthy families who collectively exercised power and did not allow any single individual or single family to rise to such prominence as the Lucumones had held in previous Etruscan history. And the Etruscans never really recover politically from that. There is a brief moment under the Etruscan leader Lars Porsena, sometime in the early 5th century, where Rome is reincorporated into Etruscan, kind of the Etruscan orbit, but that's a short-lived thing, and quickly Rome broke away again, and the Etruscans were never able to bring them under their sway, and gradually the Romans grew in power and incorporated more and more of the Etruscan lands into their orbit, right? So the movement is in the other direction. We should say something, at least briefly, about the culture of the Etruscans, because this is the main thing that enters into Roman civilization. One of their great contributions that is imitated by the Romans, borrowed by the Romans, is their statuary, mostly in bronze, but also in terracotta, which is, of course, just kind of pottery, right, that's turned into statues. A good example, maybe one of the most famous examples, is this chimera you see here, this bronze chimera, which the Etruscans seem to have had a fascination with sort of magical animals, and the chimera is one of these. It has the body is mostly a lion, but it has this snake as a tail, and it's a composite creature. So the chimera seems to have been a part of their mythology. Unfortunately, because we can't read their literature, we don't know the role that it may have played in that, other than to say that they were fascinated with it. A lot of the culture, a lot of the art in particular, gives us a kind of window into the lives of the Etruscan elites. Another very famous sculpture, this one in terracotta, is this one. This is called the sarcophagus of the two spouses. This is a sarcophagus, so this is for the burial, or the inhumation, I should say, of a body. But you can see that we have a husband and wife reclining on a daybed of some kind. And this gives us a hint of the sorts of relationships that existed between husbands and wives, or between men and women. They both have a smile on their face. They seem to be conversing with each other. There seems to be, and this is important, a kind of mutual respect between the two of them. The woman seems to be more animated here. The husband seems to be sitting back listening to his wife, not ordering her around, but actually listening to her. Now, maybe we're imposing modern sensibilities on this art, and this really didn't happen, but this idea that the Etruscans had a more egalitarian relationship between the genders is backed up by ancient sources. Both Greek and Roman sources criticize the Etruscans for being too free with their women. They portray Etruscan women as lewd, as scandalous. Now, what that probably did not mean was that they were sexually promiscuous, or that they, displayed themselves in a little too much in public or something like that, like we might suppose. What that probably meant for the Greeks was that women actually had a voice in their society, that men treated them with some amount of respect, didn't kind of order them around and put them in a severely subordinate position, as happened in places like Athens, and even to some extent in Rome, though to a lesser extent than in Greece. The religion of the Etruscans is another thing that the Romans borrow a fair amount of. The gods of the Etruscans were similar to the gods of the Indo-European peoples. They called them by different names. There seems to have been a fair amount of borrowing between the various societies, the various peoples of the Mediterranean. The chief god of the Etruscan pantheon was a sky god who wielded thunderbolts, similar to Zeus or Thor or one of these figures in the Indo-European pantheons. The name of this god was Tinia, and then there were a couple of female deities who formed a kind of partnership with Tinia. One of these was the goddess Minerva, by the way, who was the goddess of the city, not of wisdom and of strategy and of crafts and things like that. Minerva seems to have been, by the way, something the Etruscans probably borrowed from the Italic peoples, maybe from the Villanovan culture, maybe later on. But Minerva is inflected later on by the Greek version of this, the Athena goddess, and the Romans, have some combination of the Etruscan view of Minerva as the one who governs the city and city life, and Athena, who is more about wisdom and craftsmanship and things. The Etruscans also seem to have borrowed Greek figures, divine figures like Apollo and Heracles, and some of that mythology ends up in the Etruscan culture. Another aspect, and this may be the thing that fascinated the Greeks, I should say the Romans, the most about the Etruscans when it came to their religion, was their practice of divination. And I really can't underscore this enough, how important this was to Roman culture. This is one of those things where, especially if we see Romans as kind of the forerunners of modern people, where we might say, oh, they couldn't have taken that seriously, right? But the world, for these ancient Mediterranean peoples, for the Etruscans and also for the Romans, was not something given to just random chance, right? Everything was governed by either the gods or these impersonal forces like fate. And one could learn how to divine the will of the gods or divine the fates by learning certain things, learning how to interpret certain natural phenomena. There were two types of diviners among the Etruscans who end up, the same role ends up in Roman culture. The first of these is called the fulgurator, and the fulgurator's responsibility is to interpret lightning flashes. And so the fulgurator would stand facing south, which was to orient himself, according to the layout of the world as they understood it. And if lightning flashes happened on the right side as he faced south, then that would be a good omen. If they occurred on the left side, that would be a bad omen. Right and left in Roman culture is, good and evil are represented by those things. The Latin word for right hand or right side is dexter. And if you think about words like dexterity, right, that's always a positive thing. The Latin word for left hand is sinister. And if you think about what a sinister thing is, right, that's not a good thing. Okay, they felt that the left side or the left hand was evil or wrong or against the fates or a bad omen or something like this. So the fulgurator, would look at the lightning flashes and things happening on the right side, it's a good omen. Things happening on the left, that's a bad thing. And then the patterns of the flashes and things like this had specific meanings as well. There was a whole lore that went into this that would have to be studied for years to become an effective fulgurator. Probably more important than the fulgurator was the Horus Specs. The Horus Specs divined fate and the will of the gods by examining the livers of sacrificed animals. And the liver is a a complex-looking thing. There's all sorts of blood vessels in it and things like this. It's a highly vascular tissue. And so the fulgurator would sacrifice, sorry, I should say the Horus Specs would sacrifice the animal, would cut into its abdomen, remove the liver, hold it up in his hands, and look at the striations on it, look at the various lobes of the liver to see which were more developed and which less. And there was a whole lore, again, associated with interpreting these things, right? They took this stuff very seriously. They would make life or death decisions based on the interpretations offered by the Horus Specs or by the fulgurator. Again, we can't be cynical about this, right? We have to take this seriously with them and understand that they thought this was real, right? Rather than simply writing them off as strange or superstitious, right? We have to understand how important this was to them. So that, again, is something that is borrowed by the Romans and will become an important part of the religious practice of the Romans. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the Greeks. I would, in class, stop at this point and ask if there were questions. Feel free to ask those on the discussion boards. More briefly, I want to talk about the Greeks. So the map you see in front of you here is the region that the Greeks themselves called Magna Graecia. You can actually see it on the map, right? Magna Graecia. In Latin, that means Greater Greece, or the Greater Greek lands, or something like that, right? Or possibly the lands, the Greek lands outside of Greece, or something. Okay. If you think about, sometimes metropolitan areas are referred to as the Greater Washington, D.C. area, or the Greater Seattle area, or something like that, right? This is Greece away from Greece, so to speak. Italy and Sicily were, I should say southern Italy and Sicily, were major areas of settlement for the Greeks, populated almost entirely by Greek-speaking people, especially on the coasts. Now, how did this happen? Well, the Greeks underwent this period known as the Dark Age of ancient Greece, between about 1200 BCE and about 800 BCE. And this was precipitated by a series of natural disasters that led to a lot of piracy and desperation, and we needn't go into the details of that. That gets beyond the scope of this course. But emerging from that into this period known as the Archaic Age, the Greeks tended to face population pressures similar to what we saw with in our discussion about the Samnites, right? And so they would declare these sacred springs. They would send out colonists to go other places. They initially started colonizing places like Asia Minor and the Black Sea region, which they depended on for food imports and things. But by the probably the early 7th century, I should say, they were sending colonists off to southern Italy. And we noted in looking at a map earlier that, it's not a far distance really from Greece to the southern part of Italy. It's probably easier or just as easy to cross, the Adriatic or the Ionian Sea as it is to cross the Aegean and get to other parts of the eastern Mediterranean. And these were Greeks that came from a lot of different places. You can see on the map here that the parts in yellow are the Doric dialects of Greek. Those come from the island of Crete. The major center for the Doric peoples was Tarentum, up here right in the kind of the instep of the boot of Italy. Also Gala down here, and Syracuse, right? These were, Syracuse in particular, probably the second largest Greek city in the Mediterranean by about the 5th century BCE or so, after Athens. We also have a number of Achaean peoples who settled in parts of Italy, and all of the stuff in the kind of taupe color here. Achaean Greeks were of the Peloponnesus for the most part, as well as Attica. And then Ionic, this would be the peoples of the Aegean Sea, the western coast of Asia Minor, or Turkey now. And then there were northwestern Greeks who came from up in the upper parts of the Balkan Peninsula, in the region known as Boeotia, and even further north, Thessaly, and places like that. Okay, And so Greeks are coming from lots of different places. They're found in colonies here. In some cases, the colonies found other colonies, right? So a good example, one of the earliest, maybe the very earliest Greek settlement is on an island here off of the coast of what is now Naples, just off the coast of Campania here, on the island of Pithecusae. And the people of Pithecusae end up sort of overpopulating, and so they send a colony out here to head to the mainland, and it's through this that we get settlements like Cumae and Neapolis. Neapolis would grow into Naples eventually, right? It means just new city. And these are poles, meaning they're city-states, right? This isn't just a city, it's also, they're claiming the surrounding farmland, and these settlements are divided between the rural farmers and the city dwellers. And some cities reach significant size, others remain fairly small towns. I've listed here, I'm not going to go through all of these necessarily, but the largest of the poles, places like Sybaris and Rhegion and Croton, where Pythagoras lived for many years, as well as Syracuse and Hymera and Gela and places like that, right? So these were all significant population centers and significant centers of Greek culture. And this isn't like the minor leagues of Greece either. Some of the most important intellectuals in ancient Greek history come from this area. Some of the greatest philosophers lived here. In bringing in establishing their settlements, the Greeks seem to have introduced things like olives and viniculture into Italy. And so olive oil and wine were brought by the Greeks, or at least the growth of these things was precipitated a great deal by the arrival of the Greeks. We already mentioned the hoplite phalanx as the major military strategy. That was also a Greek institution. And I mentioned intellectual life. We could go through a laundry list, and Thomas Africa in the textbook, I think, does this. He sort of goes through all of the major philosophers of the ancient world who lived in Magna Graecia. One that I will mention is Pythagoras. We tend to associate Pythagoras with that dreaded thing that we all have to learn in math, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared, the relationships between the various sides of a right triangle and all of that. Okay, sorry if I'm dredging up any painful memories for any of you back to trigonometry. But that probably was not an invention of Pythagoras. It's attributed to him. Pythagoras was interested in things like ratios. He thought that nature sort of settled into these set patterns, and he thought that the universe could be understood if we just grasped the patterns that it followed, right? Pythagoras was interested in the concept of the music of the spheres. He thought that if we could learn to read the stars and the planets most effectively, we would actually hear them playing this beautiful, harmonious music that represented the ultimate in kind of ideal ratios and things like this. This was an idea that was picked up during the scientific revolution by figures like Johannes Kepler, by the way, who looked back at what these ancients did, Pythagoras and Plato and others, and really wanted that to be how the universe was structured. Of course, it wasn't, and even Kepler had to eventually abandon that idea, in favor of the ellipse, which was his major contribution. But Pythagoras was not just interested in that. He was not just a sort of retiring intellectual. He also was a religious innovator. Pythagoras taught the doctrine of reincarnation, for instance. He taught that our bodies would decay and that we would, but that our souls, or the whatever the equivalent of that was, would survive on and be reborn into another body. This eventually makes its way into Roman culture a little bit. When we read the Aeneid, you may encounter this in the scene where Aeneas goes into the underworld. I can't remember whether that is in the McKendrick and Howe selection that we'll be reading, but toward the end of Book 6 of the Aeneid, Aeneas, and he's in Elysium, the Roman kind of heaven underworld place, the good place in the underworld. And his father Ascanius teaches him about the river Lethe, where one can drink from that and forget everything and then be reborn into a new life, right? That seems to have been partly due to the influence of Pythagoras. Pythagoras settled in Croton, right here, and in the early part of the 6th century established what seems to have amounted to a kind of theocracy there. That his version of religion was the foundation of the laws of Croton. This operated in a fashion similar to the Geneva of John Calvin in the late 16th century, right? And Pythagoras had a lot of admirers and a lot of adherents. We often think of Plato as a strict adherent to the teachings of Socrates, but it seems that the older Plato got, the more fascinated he became with Pythagoras. That even though Socrates remains the main character in his dialogues, Pythagoras seems to have been the one behind the ideas that Plato was embracing increasingly in works like the Timaeus and even to some extent in the Republic. And so this Magna Graecia had a dramatic impact on the intellectual life of ancient Greece, and by extension would have a great impact on the Romans as well. They brought religious ideas to Italy, the Olympian deities, of course, some of which were adopted wholesale into the Roman pantheon eventually. Figures like Apollo, right, was originally a Greek deity. But also, there were other gods and goddesses who were sort of incorporated into existing gods and goddesses. This is why we say that, Zeus and Jupiter are really the same person. They weren't necessarily the same, but, with the arrival of this Greek religion, the Romans and other Italian peoples, borrowed some of the ideas or some of the mythology about these deities and incorporated them into their worship of these deities. The same went for a figure like Juno. The ideas about Hera had resonance, and Hera was an existing goddess, but the mythology of Juno ends up, the Greek mythology of Hera, I should say, ends up being incorporated into the story about Juno. So there's a lot of mixing of religious ideas here, which is common in any polytheistic pantheon. Polytheism lends itself much more easily, I should say, to merging conceptions about deities, right? There are fewer truth claims, so to speak, than in a monotheistic faith. One key figure that is brought by the Greeks is this prophetess known as the Sibyl of Cumae. Again, Cumae is this city-state here in Campania near Naples. And there was a temple to Apollo there. And the Sibyl of Cumae, as she was called, was the prophetess. There was mythology about her that Apollo had fallen in love with her, but that she rejected him, and so he then, kind of declared that she would be given 1,000 years of life, but that she would continue to age through that entire 1,000 years. So the Sibyl was a tremendously wrinkled old woman who simply couldn't die, right? Probably suffered all of the aches and pains of age and things like that, right? So she's cursed a little bit by Apollo there, or more than a little bit. But the Sibyl had a stature similar to the Oracle of Delphi, who was also a priestess of Apollo. In the Italian orbit, in the orbit of Magna Graecia, the Sibyl of Cumae was the one they visited to ask questions about, important decisions that they would make to try to divine the will of the gods. So the Temple of Apollo at Cumae was this really important religious institution. And the Greeks were not the only ones to go there. The Romans eventually, also visit this. Probably the Etruscans and others, take this very seriously too. We also see in this very early period the arrival of mystery cults. These are more personal forms of religion. We will talk about them at greater length later in the semester, but the origins of those things, especially the Eleusinian mysteries associated with the worship of the goddess Demeter, or Ceres as she was called in the Roman pantheon, made their way into Magna Graecia and probably inflected Italian religion more generally from there. Okay, there's a lot more we could say about the Greeks, and I really haven't gone into the political history of this to talk about the various rulers of these places. I think that's the kind of detail that we don't necessarily need to discuss. What I wanted to do today was to talk about the influence of the Etruscans and the Greeks on Roman culture more generally, and hopefully I've done that. If there are questions, please, as always, ask them in the discussion boards, and I look forward to talking about these with you. So next time we will turn our attention to Rome under the Etruscan kings and their effort to break away and become independent. You will want to have read some of the Livy reading before you look at that video lecture. You'll at least want to be conversant in that, and probably have it handy with you. Have the McKendrick and Howe book with you as you